Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're coming from and where you're joining us from. We have a really exciting webinar today. We have great speakers, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a few minutes. But before that, I just want to say that this topic today is about security scanners around code. So we will start off with, first of all, why do we need this even? And this is sort of part of our secure code training in general, where we're trying to educate development teams about how to become more secure, what tools to use, what best practices. And I think this is a big part of the development, I would say, stack, the things that they sort of need to look at it at first. So first of all, I'll let you both introduce yourself and then we're gonna kick it off. So Roland, do you wanna
Yes, I'll
kick
kick
it
it
off?
off. Hi, everyone. I'm Roland. I'm one of the co-founders of Aikido Security. We're a company based out of Belgium in Europe, and we're a scanner product, and we have a bunch of scanners, and very much focused on the SMB market because we combine a bunch of scanners together. And I have a background in product management. Now I'm more on the commercial operational side, but I do have a good understanding of how the product works, obviously. So here in that capacity today.
Cool. And Itzik, he's also Wizer CTO, but I'll let you introduce yourself, Itzik.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Itzik. I'm the CTO at Wizer, and my background is I'm a software developer. So for many, many years, developed products, many different types of products, and always security was top of mind. And so now with Wizer, we're also, working on secure code development and so forth. So deep into that as well. But for our own team, had to go through this question about the scanners and so forth. So it's really an interesting topic for me to talk about and and discuss.
So you know what, Itzik, let's start with that. I want you to sort of, take the seat of the R&D manager, which you are, and sort of explain why do we even need scanners before we go into like how they work, like what's the problem we're trying to solve? Because there is like, you know, all type of scanners. I won't go into now all the ticky words, but explain high level, why do we need them?
I think it's a great question. So first of all, the level, the resolution that developers can review by themselves, even if they are very knowledgeable. And we are going through trainings and we are teaching our teams, secure coding and OS 10. We're going deep as much as we can. We have special project to handle and prioritize and so forth. And with all that, the level of coverage and the coverage kind of like resolution that we can have on the code is limited. So we were, starting to think about how can we expand the range of things that we can check at the same time, and we can also adjust to and align with the rapid change of the code base, because this changes all the time. We're adding code pieces, we're changing code, we're changing infrastructure and architecture and configuration, we're changing pieces of code, we're adding more products. All of that needs to be considered, and if we had to count on manual process of review and kind of like trusting our people, and it's not that we don't trust them. I don't think people are, able to cover this amount of code at the same time. We can't have people do it manually. And we were looking for something that will be incorporated in our process and will constantly check, a wide spectrum of things that we can talk about today, but wide spectrum of things that we want to test.
So let's I wanted to explain a little bit more about the risks that you were mostly concerned about. Like you're talking about like developers being overwhelmed with so many things to look at. I get it, but what raised the flag where you were like, okay, this is a big risk. If this happens, like we're in trouble.
So I think, again, a good question. So I think the issue is not one, right? The issue is the overwhelming, different types that could happen. we've seen situations of IDORs, we've seen situations of XSS in our code base, and it continues popping. And our developers are really knowledgeable. They know what it is. When they figure it out, they fix it very quickly. But it is very hard for them to cover all this space. So what raises my attention is that pen tests actually show that no matter what we do, we continue to get those things, and we continue to see those vulnerabilities that maybe if something could have tested our best practices and things that are broad and really covering everything, I don't know if everything, but at least a lot, we could have captured a lot. So that was the trigger, I think, for that type of thing.
So you think the pen test sort of reveal that when we do it again and again and again, no matter how good we are, and we do peer reviews and all of that, we're always like, there's always something to find, and potentially scanners can reduce that even more. They won't
Exactly.
take over all of that, but that's sort of what was okay. So Roland, you are a scanner, you're a vendor in this space. So first of all, is that sort of what you're trying to solve? And B, how does it work? How do you do you cover the entire OWASP 10, part of it? Like, what are the areas that you sort of cover?
Yeah, I think one of the great examples is like the log4j.
Yep.
Like when it happens, the whole world is in panic, and then at that moment, like calling a pen tester, like by the time that person arrives, it might be too late. So that's like a great example of where a scanner can pick it up. And it's actually coincidentally yesterday, something called polyfill.io got hacked, or they lost access to the domain, and now 100,000 websites are affected and prone for a supply chain attack. So we immediately jumped on it, saw if our scanner could pick it up. We found it, did some tweaks to make sure it was accurate, and then we just started blasting all of our customers with like, you have this thing, you need to get rid of it right now. It only happens like, so we have automatic alerts that happen with criticalities, but when there's something this critical, we even take the time and effort to email them personally to make sure that they definitely take that thing out of there or update it. And I think that's where a scanner, with that continuous scanning, definitely has a lot of value. And if you do pen test, that's like a great picture that you take, that you kind of like dress up and you make sure you look nice, and then it's once a year. But the world is continuously evolving. The NVD database is updated every 6 hours with new vulnerabilities, so you definitely want to, even if you don't have to fix everything right away, but you might want to get that alert for that new critical that arrives for sure.
So you're talking about a specific library, right? So a lot of developers it's not part of their code, they're just using the package. So even if they do a peer review or anything like that, that won't help, because they don't have time to go to the libraries they use and get an update about something that happened with each library and library. It's just like almost impossible, especially when you have nested libraries, right?
Yeah.
So like one library is using another library. How do you know? So those scanners go deep, right? They don't go one level. Some of them go 3 levels, 6 levels down. So I would say beyond overwhelming and always missing things, there are just things that without a scanner, you can just it's unhuman to even expect anyone to go that deep.
Yeah, for sure. That's entirely true. And that's, I think that's the difference between a bad scanner and a good scanner, right? Like the good scanner will be able to go through those transitive dependencies and take that context. Bad scanners or like simple scanners will just do like a find all, report all, and then it's up to you to like triage them. But yeah, for sure.
So I would love to touch that point, but before that, I want to set expectations. So a question for both of you. So we were talking about, okay, so a pen test is sort of many times the eye opener where we're like, okay, we are finding a lot of issues, we have to do something about it. But so it sounds like, can a scanner replace it? If I put a scanner, do I still need to do pen tests? Like, yeah,
I would say
any one of you can start.
I can start as representing kind of like the consumer, the person who's using it. I would never think about not doing pen tests because I have a scanner. I think they're supplementary in many cases. Like the pen testers are human beings with a ton of experience, and they're able to look very deep and find those tricky paths into something that could consist of some vulnerabilities, but also common sense and other things that I don't think scanners are yet able to do that deep. So I think pen tests are, as you mentioned, Roland, I think it's a picture in time. It's a snapshot, right? And even that is low resolution relatively, because again, we're talking about people. However, they're trying to find those very big impact things, and they go for the crown, right? They really actually look at those things that could be very dangerous. So I think they're supplementary. I don't think you can replace them. And I don't think, a code scanner can even replace anything. It just adds something really important, which is, from my perspective, the coverage.
So just as an example for the audience, we were talking about, for example, IDORs, which many of them are just logical bugs, and expecting a scanner to sort of understand the logic of your app and to figure out that, there is an access control, way to bypass. That's like almost impossible for a scanner to do that. They're usually looking for either specific patterns or libraries. And IDORs have been some of the worst attacks out there, right, Itzik? It's like, we've seen a lot of them, and every time they're different. They don't have a specific pattern even.
Right, because there are multiple levels. There are very simple ones. You just change the ID and get to another object. That's trivial, but there are other ways to do like multiple levels that you get to an IDOR and you get to get a reference to an object that you're not authenticate or authorized to get to, and that takes a little bit more time to find. But also pen testers that are really talented find them, and they find those things, and they are actually, those things some of them can go into the database for the scanners in the future, right? But again, just like the pen test is a picture in time, I think the scanners have some database of options that they go through, right? And it's limited, it's finite. And so it doesn't include all those sophisticated cases where in time, I think it will include more and more. But the world is moving. And again, as we said, it's not only our code is moving, is the infrastructure and the libraries are all constantly changing, moving, and it's a moving target. It's really hard.
So maybe we'll do another webinar, because I don't want people to think that, a pen test is an absolute snapshot in time, because it also depends who the pen testers are,
Absolutely.
what coverage you gave them, and what their skill set was. So like, that's a whole different conversation, how often you do it. Do you go and do bug bounty programs on top of that? Do you invite red team? Like, that's a whole new thing. So scanners is just a part of that. So Roland, so you talk a little bit about, when I use a scanner, should I use is there like one scanner that does it all? Like, when we look at which scanners do we choose, how many scanners are even out there? Do they overlap? Like, how do I even get started when it comes to scanning? And I would love to, if you can give us sort of like with your product and also without your product. So like, I don't have any product. Can I still do something with scanning if I don't have money, I don't have budget? What should I do tomorrow?
Yeah, for sure. I would say there's many areas or domains out there, and for each area, there's a scanner out there. For example, you can have a secret scanner, which is very different from an open source dependency scanner. But there are two areas that you should care about. So secrets, open source dependencies, your static code analysis for the typical SQL injection and cross-site scripting is another one. Then you also probably want to scan your infrastructure as code if you are using Terraform Helm charts. So that would be another domain. And so for each of these domains, there's scanners out there. And there's some good free versions out there as well. Like, for example, in GitHub, you get something called Dependabot. And Dependabot is great at finding your outdated dependencies or the vulnerable dependencies. And that's definitely a great starting point if you're trying to get acquainted and your code base is still relatively small and not that much legacy. It'll definitely do the job. As you grow, there's a point where you graduate out of that free tool. But to explore, it's great. Another alternative there would be Renovate Bot if you're looking for something else there to consider. Same thing with secret scanning. There's a bunch of specific secret scanners out there, like Truffle is one of them. They have an open source. I think Git Guardian has a free version. Um, we ourselves also have a secret scanner in our product. It's based off GitLeaks. GitLeaks is an open source or considered the best in class open source secret scanner. So you could also, that's another thing, like you could go for a free scanner or you could go for an open source. The free typically comes with some strings attached or some paywall at some point.
Or an
Versus
upsell opportunity.
yeah, versus the open source is more, yeah, free forever, but then you need to do the maintenance of setting it up. But if you like GitLeaks is not too bad. Like you could run that as a test to see what comes out of it for sure.
And do I need, like, can any developer just go out and find, how much work is it to like go out and find what are the skills that I need to maintain it? Again, let's say I have a small team, I don't know, like 10 developers, just got started, even less. First of all, for 5 developers, like, is that a good time to implement a scanner? And which scanner do I start with? Is there any one specific, or should I just like any domain that I should start with, or do I just go and select all and implement all the packages that I can find and hope for the best?
I think roughly speaking, putting it a little bit black and white, but there's like two types of 5 developer companies. One is where you have a CTO that has experience and is knowledgeable and has gone through these things. And then that person know that they need something for secrets for open source dependencies. And they might have that list in their head somewhere, or they might have read about it or educated themselves. The second type of customers, again, black and white, would be the ones where they don't do anything until they're forced to do. And the force typically comes from the customer because they're trying to sell a fintech product or a health tech product to a hospital or a bank. And then they get the security questionnaire. And then the security questionnaire is typically the driver of the scanners that they'll look for, because the security questionnaire will be, what do you use for secret scanning? How do you manage your dependencies? How do you, and if you want to check those boxes, you'll find yourself exploring these scanners. And if you do this enough, you'll probably go for an ISO or a SOC 2 because that kind of like accelerates some of these checkboxes. But then you'll probably crystallize on 8, 9, 10 different scanners in total, because those are the ones that keep on coming back. And those are the ones that we in Aikido try to productize and put into one product.
So once, let's say, okay, I do that, I take those 9 scanners, I took the time, I took the effort, I install them, I check the boxes. What should I expect to happen next? Like, is it going to be like a bunch of alert? Like, how overwhelming is it? And how much overload it will put on my team? And how do I start with, with the output that they deliver?
Yeah. If you are going for a compliance standard like ISO 27001 or SOC 2 Type 2, it might become a burden because those compliance standards will force you to have an SLA, and the SLA will mandate a critical needs to be fixed within 2 days, a high needs to be tackled within 7 days.
Oh, wow.
So now you're on the clock, right? And now it's not ad hoc or and so then it can start becoming like an overload. And that's when you start to triage and make sure that they get planned and get fixed. And then that's typically the moment where you're like, okay, maybe we should buy a product that can help us do that, because at a certain point, that's like the challenge or the disease and security, like the amount of false positives and lack of context and wasting time of developers. And that's why there's products like us in the market to help you combat that.
And who's getting those alerts? Is it the security officer, the CTO, and they're distributing it to the developers, or are the developers, when they're compiling their code or during the build, they're getting each one individually, and they need to decide and they need to be trained about, like you said, severity. If it's this, do this. If it's that, do that. Like, how does it work? Who's in charge?
I've seen it in many different shapes and forms. Like I've seen the Slack channel where everything gets pushed to the one Slack channel with webhooks, and they use some Zapier things to get it all in there. Other people will try to get it in Jira, create it as tickets. Other organizations do it like scanner by scanner. What I mean by that is, for example, the Panabot can open up PRs. So the PRs will be sitting in your GitHub. So then that's sitting in there. But then, for example, they're all running AWS, and in AWS, you have Security Hub, and then it might only be the cloud engineer or the CTO that looks in that particular place. Some people set up a CI gate where in the pipeline, they can have the pipeline set to fail if there's a critical SAST or critical dependency. And then at that point, you're like forcing a workflow on your developer, and anything in between or any combination of those things. And that's what they typically refer to with the term shift left, is because you shift left in the software development lifecycle. And then it's up to you to decide, like, do you start in the IDE already? Do you then scan the branches, the pipeline, the repos, and like, where do you put the hooks? And so it also typically depends on your industry. Like when I'm talking with health tech, they will be, this needs to be blocked if I'm pushing a license, and that's more about IP risk. But if they push an LGPL or a GPL3, that build is going to be blocked. They don't care. It's going to block the development process, because they're in such a regulated space, versus other smaller startups that are, for example, in gaming, where they don't deal with sensitive PII. They'll be like, okay, we'll fix that later. We don't want to block the developer in their process. Let's get it shipped, and then let's worry about it later. Yeah.
So what do people usually see in terms of time spent on managing, and for developers, I mean, like, should I expect like 10%, 15%? Like what now? Like how much longer will it take to release a build now that I have to deal with this? How much time will it take for my developers?
I would say 5 to 10%, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Cool.
mean, there's also ways that you can bring that to 20 or 30.
Yeah.
Nobody wants that, but you could find yourself in that. Depends on legacy, right? If your company has been around for 10 years and you started coding back in 2014, that'll be a different landscape or a different situation than when you start fresh and vanilla right now. Yeah.
And okay, one more question, and then we'll move to a different topic. But in terms of quality of the alerts, so we talk about false, but sometimes I don't know if this falls under false, but I'm using a library. It has a CVE, it has something, but I'm not using that functionality. Like how, if I'm going to spend time investigating over and over and over again something that exists in the library, but just totally unrelated to me because we're not using that functionality, like what do I do there? Because that can take, especially if I'm using a lot of libraries.
I think, and this is not to plug our product, but I think we're one of the few products. So you would need a product to manage that, because you cannot do it directly in your IDE or your Git.
Yeah.
So it would require a product like ours. And then I guess that's what we do, right? Like we go and do the reachability analysis. We go through all the transitive dependencies. We'll identify the dev dependencies there to see if something goes to production, yes or no. On top of that, you can configure your repos in Aikido. Like you can tell it if it's like your crown jewel repo, which is internet connected, or the other way around, whether it's like an old repo that's not internet connected, and that'll influence the scoring as well. And then we were users before we created this company of many scanners before, and we found that there was a lack of productivity features. And with productivity, I mean snoozing things, ignoring things. And when you ignore something, for example, we will give you the option to ignore just the issue, or ignore the issue across all the repos, or just in one repo, or just on a path within a repo. So we give you that level of granularity to deal with all the small frustrations that, like, when you're in that situation where I want to ignore it, but only for this type or only in that scope, a product like ours allows you to do that.
which basically says that, look, guys, nothing is really free, right? Like you use something free, then you have to put the hours, right? You have to put the resources because, and I think that's true for most of the products out there, thinking, if we take security awareness, for example, thinking that you'll just push a button and you'll get a security culture, I think that's an overstretch, right? Like you still have to have someone that actually cares and takes care of it and follow-ups and all of those things. So from what I understand, we've talked a lot about some of the issues. Your product deals with probably many of those things. When you say productize, it basically makes it simple to install, makes it maybe consolidates the alerts, looks at the reachability and all of those things. And it's not just your product. I guess there's some other products in the market that do the same, but that's sort of the idea between free and paid. Like
Yeah.
totally free, it's up to you to do all of that. Paid, it's sort of like some of the automation has been done for you.
That's a typical trade-off, although we do need to keep, obviously we need to keep on innovating, but a dependable bot is not going to get worse over time. And GitHub is very interested in like taking that in-house so that you don't have like, nobody wants you to go out and buy another tool, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to buy another tool, but sometimes you have to, or there's no other option. But like with their Copilot and their dependable bot and like some of their security features, like we as a pure security product company cannot become lazy and think that we will be able to charge for certain functionalities indefinitely. So it's definitely it's becoming more and more for free. So our added value needs to become more and more advanced and more ahead of time, or more and more innovative for sure.
Gotcha. Do you think maybe it already there, but does AI play a role in the future of scanners or even now?
AI will definitely, or I'll put it, LLMs will definitely play in the future of static code analysis, because these large language models are really good with languages, and not only human languages, but also coding languages. And so in their creation, they've been trained on a ton of code. And so they're really good at spotting the human errors. So the static code analysis, there's definitely a lot of opportunity with LLMs there to, one, identify issues that a classic rule, a classic SAST rule could not always uncover. It's really good at validating, because SAST is notoriously bad in terms of signal to noise ratio. There's tons of false positives, and an LLM will be able to triage. And an LLM is also able to suggest remediations because it's smart enough to do that. Now, that is something that we are working on right now, and I'm sure we're not the only ones. But in a natural way, LLMs and static code like go very well hand in hand. For other areas, it's going to be less. I mean, they can always enhance, but I think the static code part is definitely the one where you'll see a lot of improvements.
I actually
Itzy.
find
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually find the DAST to be potentially interesting for AI and LLM. And here's why. Because I do feel like when you're trying to tackle, black box test, you're trying to kind of like tackle APIs and so forth, you need to have some kind of like intelligence, artificial or real, human, to be able to kind of like find those paths and find those ideas that are a little bit more comprehensive than just logical gates. It needs to be kind of like some experience and the database of situations and combinations of which, and the way you compound them and so forth. So I definitely think that can also, and again, I'm not an expert, but it's just my assumption that AI could definitely help there as well.
Yeah, that's a good remark. I agree with that one.
So I actually wanted to ask that, Itzik, and you sort of answered it, but for the audience, can you sort of explain the difference between dynamic